It happened late one evening in the kitchen of our house in Tampa, the kind of humid night where even with the air conditioning running, the windows still looked tired. I had just come home from work, loosened my tie, and set my keys beside the fruit bowl Emily kept pretending she was going to keep full. The dishwasher hummed. A lamp over the sink threw a soft yellow light across the counter. Nothing about the room looked unusual. Emily was standing by the table with a mug in her hand, not drinking from it, just holding it like she needed something warm to wrap her fingers around. She didn't look angry. That was the first thing I noticed. No tension in her face. No red eyes. No build-up to a fight. She set the mug down carefully and said, in a calm, level voice, "Deal with it. I'm not sleeping with you anymore." That was it. No apology. No explanation. No attempt to soften it. Just a sentence laid down between us like it had already been discussed somewhere else, somewhere I hadn't been invited. I looked at her for a few seconds longer than I normally would have. Not because I was shocked into silence, although I was. It was because I was trying to understand what I was hearing. There are things people say in anger that don't belong to the truth. This wasn't one of them. I could tell by the way she stood there, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady, like she had already crossed a line in her own mind and was simply informing me of it. In that moment, I realized this wasn't a threat. It wasn't the start of an argument. It was a decision. I didn't answer. I just stood there in my work clothes, smelling like office air and the inside of my car, while the dishwasher kept humming and the kitchen kept pretending to be a normal kitchen. Something in me understood, before I was ready to admit it, that the sentence itself mattered less than the calm way she said it. That was the part one couldn't shake. Before that night in the kitchen, our life looked normal in the quiet, predictable way most adult lives do. Nothing dramatic. Nothing anyone would point to and say something was wrong. From the outside, we were the kind of couple people assume is doing just fine. I worked as a regional operations manager for a logistics company headquartered just outside Tampa. The job was steady and demanding in the way logistics always is. Numbers, schedules, freight routes, delays that had to be solved before they turned into bigger problems. Most of my days were built around systems and patterns. Trucks leaving on time. Containers arriving where they were supposed to. Small adjustments that kept everything moving. Emily worked as a marketing specialist at a mid-sized tech firm downtown. Her work sounded more abstract when she talked about it. Campaigns, branding meetings, digital strategy. The kind of work that came with presentations and brainstorming sessions instead of spreadsheets and freight reports. We owned a modest house not far from the bay. Nothing extravagant. Just a quiet neighborhood where most houses had the same palm trees in the front yard and the same mailboxes slowly fading under the Florida sun. On Sunday mornings, we had a routine. Coffee from a small place near Bayshore, then a slow drive back through the neighborhood while the streets were still quiet. Sometimes we'd stop at the grocery store on the way home and pick up things we probably didn't need. Evenings were predictable too. Dinner, usually simple. Then the couch, the TV, and whatever show we were halfway through that month. Looking back, I realize how much of that normalcy came from not asking too many questions. Emily sometimes stayed late at work. Marketing deadlines, she said. Campaign launches. Client calls that ran longer than expected. Other nights, she mentioned extra projects. Things that required her to meet people outside the office or spend a few hours working somewhere quiet. I didn't push for details. Part of it was trust. But if I'm honest, a larger part was something simpler. I believed that this was what adulthood looked like. Two careers moving at different speeds. A house to maintain. Bills to pay. Occasional distance that you simply accepted as part of the rhythm. At the time, none of it seemed unusual. If anything, I told myself it was proof that life was working the way it was supposed to. After that conversation in the kitchen, something subtle changed in the way I looked at things. On the surface, nothing about our daily life shifted. Emily still left for work at the same time in the morning. We still had dinner most evenings. The house stayed quiet and orderly, the same way it always had been. But the sentence she had spoken sat in the background of everything. Deal with it. It wasn't the kind of phrase you forgot. For the first few days, I moved through my routine almost automatically. Work still demanded the same attention. Trucks still needed routing. Delays still had to be resolved, and clients still expected answers. Logistics doesn't pause because something feels strange at home. But somewhere in the back of my mind, a different process had started. I began noticing things that, before that moment, I probably would have ignored. Emily's phone, For example, she had always used the same simple passcode. One evening I saw her unlock it, and the motion of her fingers was different. Later, when she left the phone on the counter and stepped into the other room, the screen lit up briefly. A notification appeared and disappeared almost instantly when she came back and picked it up. A few days later, I realized she had changed the password entirely. Then there were Saturdays. She started mentioning yoga classes, something she had never talked about before. At first, it sounded casual, like a small lifestyle change. But the timing became consistent. Every Saturday morning, around the same time, she would leave the house dressed in athletic clothes and return a few hours later looking relaxed but oddly quiet. I never asked where the studio was. Messages became another small detail. Sometimes her phone would vibrate while we were sitting in the living room. She would glance down at the screen, read something quickly, and the message would disappear a moment later. The motion was smooth, practiced, almost automatic. None of it, by itself, meant anything. People change routines. They pick up new hobbies. They adjust their privacy without explanation. But once you stop telling yourself that everything is normal, small details begin to settle into place differently. I didn't confront her. I didn't ask questions. Instead, I stopped convincing myself that the patterns didn't exist. A few weeks after that night in the kitchen, I woke up one morning with a feeling I hadn't expected. Calm. Not relief. Not acceptance. Just a quiet kind of clarity that settled in before I was even fully awake. For a while I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me. The house was quiet. Emily had already left for work. Her side of the bed was neatly made, the way she always left it when she woke up before I did. The strange thing was that I didn't feel the urge to figure anything out anymore. For weeks my mind had been circling the same questions. Why had she said it that way? What had changed? Was there something I was supposed to fix, explain, or apologize for? That morning, the questions simply stopped. It wasn't because I had answers. It was because I realized something simpler. She had already made her decision. The sentence in the kitchen hadn't been the beginning of a conversation. It had been the end of one I didn't know we were having. Once that thought settled in, something inside me shifted. I got out of bed, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table where that moment had happened weeks earlier. The same yellow light above the sink, the same quiet hum of the refrigerator. The room looked exactly the same, but I felt different sitting there. Before that morning, part of me had still been trying to repair something, trying to find the right conversation, the right explanation, the right way to bring things back to whatever normal used to be. But you can't repair something the other person has already stepped away from. That realization didn't make me angry. It didn't even make me sad in the way I would have expected. It just made things simple. From that point on, I stopped thinking about how to fix our marriage. On the outside, nothing about my behavior changed. I still spoke to Emily the same way. We still had dinner together most nights. If someone had walked into our house, they wouldn't have noticed anything unusual. But internally, a line had been drawn. I wasn't trying to hold the structure together anymore. If you've made it this far, this story clearly caught your attention. If you're enjoying it, drop a like on the video. It helps me see what kind of stories you want more of next. Let's keep going. Instead, I started paying attention. Once I stopped trying to interpret everything emotionally, patterns began to appear with surprising clarity. It wasn't dramatic. No sudden discoveries or obvious mistakes. Just small, repeating details that started lining up the way numbers sometimes do in a spreadsheet when you finally notice the column you missed. Thursdays were the first thing I recognized. Emily began working late, almost every Thursday. At first it sounded reasonable. Marketing departments often push deadlines toward the end of the week. Campaigns launch on Fridays. Reports get finalized. But after a few weeks, the timing became too consistent to ignore. She would leave for work at the usual time in the morning. Around 6 in the evening, she would send a short message saying she needed to stay longer at the office. Sometimes she added that the team was ordering dinner. She always came home around the same time. Not exhausted. Not frustrated. Just quiet. Saturdays followed a similar rhythm. Her yoga classes started early in the morning, and she usually returned around noon. The interesting thing wasn't the schedule itself. It was how little she talked about it. People who pick up a new hobby tend to mention it occasionally. The instructor, the studio, the soreness afterward. Emily never did. Then there were the credit card statements. I handled most of the household finances, mostly because my job had trained me to track numbers carefully. At the end of each month, I would sit down at my desk and go through our accounts the same way I always had. That's when I noticed a few restaurants that didn't look familiar. They weren't extravagant places, just small, mid-range restaurants around Tampa that we had never visited together. The dates on the transactions lined up with the same evenings she had been working late. Still, none of it was proof of anything. But one evening, while Emily was in the shower, I opened an old tablet that had been sitting in a drawer in the living room. Years ago, she had used it for work presentations before switching to a newer laptop. When the screen powered on, I saw that some of her old messaging apps were still synced. Most of the conversations were outdated. Project discussions, old group chats, reminders from years earlier. But one name appeared repeatedly in the message list: Nate. The thread itself wasn't fully visible anymore. Many of the messages had already been deleted, but enough fragments remained to make one thing clear. This wasn't a recent conversation. It had been going on for a while. Seeing the name in those messages changed the way I looked at everything that followed. Until then, the situation had still lived mostly in the personal space between Emily and me. Strange behavior, unanswered questions, a quiet shift inside our marriage that neither of us had addressed directly. But once I started reviewing the financial records more carefully, the situation moved beyond that. At the end of the next week, I sat at my desk in the small room we used as a home office and opened our shared banking account. It was the same routine I had followed for years, checking statements, confirming payments, making sure everything lined up the way it should. That's when I noticed the transfers. At first, they looked ordinary. A few $1,000s moved from our joint savings into another account. The description field was vague, something about an investment contribution, the kind of label banks allow people to write themselves. I searched further back. There were several transfers spread across different months. None of them had been discussed with me. I opened the old tablet again and scrolled through the message fragments involving Nate. Most of the conversation was gone, but a few lines still remained between the empty spaces where messages had been deleted. Words like launch, funding, and prototype. At one point, Emily had written something short that stayed with me. Once the investment clears, we'll be able to move forward. The amount mentioned in the messages matched the transfers I had just seen in the bank account. That was the moment I understood this was no longer just about a relationship quietly falling apart. Part of our shared savings had been moved somewhere else. I closed the tablet and sat there for a long time, looking at the numbers on the screen. The next morning, during my lunch break at work, I made a phone call. The attorney's office was in Jacksonville. Her name was Megan Collins, and she specialized in family law cases that involved financial disputes. A colleague from years ago had mentioned her during a conversation about prenups and asset protection. When we finally spoke later that week, I brought a copy of our prenuptial agreement with me. She read through the document slowly, occasionally marking sections with a pen. When she finished, she looked up and said only one sentence: "You might want to use this clause." The conversation didn't happen immediately. For a while after meeting with Megan Collins, nothing in our house changed on the surface. Emily continued her routines, and I continued mine. The difference was that I had stopped wondering what was happening and had started documenting it instead. Bank statements were saved. Dates were written down. Copies of messages from the old tablet were exported and stored where they wouldn't disappear. Quiet work, the kind that didn't require confrontation. Emily began noticing the distance before she knew the reason for it. Not the obvious kind. We still spoke, still shared meals, still moved around the same house, but the small absence of curiosity. I stopped asking where she had been. I stopped reacting to the late Thursdays or the Saturday mornings. People notice when their explanations are no longer needed. One evening, about 3 weeks after my meeting with the attorney, she started the conversation herself. We were sitting at the dining table after dinner. Plates cleared, the room quiet except for the faint sound of traffic outside. Emily looked at me for a moment longer than usual. "You've been different," she said. I didn't answer right away. I simply waited. She leaned back slightly in her chair, folding her arms like she was preparing to explain something complicated. "Look," she said after a pause, "I think we should talk about what this actually is." Her tone wasn't defensive. If anything, it sounded practical. She explained that divorce would create unnecessary complications. The house, our finances, our social circles, the way things looked from the outside. Instead, she suggested something else. "We can live separate lives," she said. "People do it all the time. The idea, according to her, was simple. We would keep the house, maintain our public image, attend events when necessary, and avoid the disruption that a formal divorce would bring. She spoke for a long time. About stability, about appearances, about how complicated legal processes could become if we pushed things too far. At one point, she even used the phrase, a practical arrangement. When she finally stopped talking, the room felt unusually still. I looked at her for a few seconds, considering the proposal the same way I would evaluate a contract at work. Then I gave the only answer I needed to give. I'll think about it. The process didn't begin with a dramatic confrontation. It began quietly, exactly the way most legal processes do. Paperwork. A few days after that conversation at the dining table, I sent the documents Megan Collins had asked for. Bank statements, copies of the prenuptial agreement, screenshots of the remaining messages from the tablet, and a timeline of financial transfers I had already organized. She responded with a short email confirming that everything was sufficient to move forward. From that point on, most of the work happened outside the house. Filing documents, requesting financial records, submitting formal notices. The kind of administrative steps that feel slow while they're happening, but create momentum once they're in motion. At home, Emily continued her routines as if nothing had changed. Thursday evenings, Saturday mornings, occasional late nights at the office. But something shifted about 2 weeks after the paperwork was filed. The first sign was a phone call she received one evening while we were both in the living room. I wasn't listening intentionally, but the tone of her voice changed almost immediately. Short answers, long pauses. When she hung up, she sat still for a moment, staring at the screen. Was that work? I asked. She hesitated. Something like that. The following days were different. She started asking questions casually, almost as if they had just occurred to her. Did you talk to anyone about our finances recently? Have you been going through the accounts? The questions weren't accusations. They sounded more like someone trying to confirm a suspicion they already had. I answered simply, just reviewing things. A few days later, she found the envelope. It had arrived by certified mail earlier that afternoon while I was still at work. The return address was the law office in Jacksonville. By the time I got home, the envelope had already been opened and placed neatly on the kitchen counter. Emily was sitting at the table when I walked in. The documents were spread out in front of her, several pages marked with yellow tabs. For the first time in months, she looked unsettled. Not angry, just surprised at how far things had already moved without her realizing it. You filed, she said quietly. I set my keys on the counter and nodded. The strange thing was that I didn't feel like anything dramatic had happened. The system was simply doing what systems are designed to do. Once the process starts, it continues moving forward on its own. The legal process moved the way large systems always do, quietly, steadily, and without much concern for anyone's emotions. Once the initial filings were submitted, everything became structured. Requests for financial records were issued. Bank statements were reviewed in detail. Transfers between accounts were traced and documented. What had once looked like a few scattered transactions began to form a timeline. I didn't need to participate much after that. Megan handled most of it. Occasionally, she would call to clarify a date or confirm the purpose of a specific account. Each time the conversation was brief and professional, the way you'd expect when someone is simply moving through a checklist. Meanwhile, life inside the house grew quieter. Emily stopped mentioning yoga classes. The Thursday evenings disappeared as well. She spent more time at home, often sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open, reading through documents that had been forwarded to her by her own attorney. At one point, she asked if we could talk again. We sat across from each other in the living room one evening, the same way we had many times before, but the tone of the conversation had changed. She wasn't proposing arrangements anymore. She was negotiating. She talked about keeping the house, about restructuring the financial agreement, about simplifying the situation so neither of us had to drag this out. I listened without interrupting. What she didn't seem to understand yet was that the decisions were no longer being made inside the house. The process had already moved beyond personal discussions. Bank records had been submitted. The prenuptial agreement had been reviewed. The clause Megan had pointed out, the one involving undisclosed financial transfers, had become part of the case. Once legal structures begin applying themselves, they operate independently of personal preferences. A few weeks later, the house in Tampa was listed for sale. The decision came through the attorneys as part of the settlement structure. The property would be sold, and the remaining assets divided according to the agreement. The day I signed the final document, I was sitting in Megan's office in Jacksonville. She slid the last page across the desk, pointed to the signature line, and waited. I read through it once more, not because I expected anything new to appear, but because that's how I handle contracts. Then I signed. When I stepped outside the building a few minutes later, the afternoon air felt warm and still. I didn't feel victory. I didn't feel defeat. I just understood that some stories don't end with arguments or apologies. They end quietly, with a signature on a page and the sound of a door closing behind you. A few months later, I moved to Charleston. The decision wasn't dramatic. It was mostly practical. The logistics company I worked for had an operations hub there, and transferring offices was easier than starting over somewhere completely new. A different port, a different network of routes, but the same kind of work. I rented a small place not far from the water. Nothing fancy, just a quiet apartment where the mornings started with the sound of boats moving through the harbor instead of traffic on Bayshore. Life became simple again. Work during the day, long walks in the evening. Sometimes dinner at a small place down the street where nobody knew anything about my past. Every now and then, usually late at night, I think back to that moment in the kitchen in Tampa. Emily standing by the table, setting her mug down, saying that one sentence as calmly as if she were commenting on the weather. Deal with it. At the time, I thought that moment was the end of something. Looking back now, I understand it was actually the beginning. Not of conflict, not of revenge, just the moment when I finally stopped ignoring what was already there. That's the end of this story. If you made it all the way here, consider subscribing to stay with us. I've placed a couple of recommended videos on screen for you. Pick one and keep watching. I'll see you in the next story.